Hi, I'm Katie Treggiden, author of Wasted When Trash Becomes Treasure, and I'm here with Design Milk for DMTV Milkshake. I've got a bunch of questions in this hat and I'm going to pull some of them out and answer them. The Brian Thill quote, "Though we try to imagine otherwise, waste is every object plus time," prefaces the introduction to your book. Do you think there are any exceptions to this? Do you know, I really don't. And it's interesting that we tend to think about things like a single-use coffee cup. We know that becomes waste very quickly. Often I talk to designers and makers about the waste involved in their practices, and they'll say, well, my piece of furniture is designed to be handed down through generations. And my question is always, and then what? I think sometimes that time can be hundreds of years, but at some point that object is going to become obsolete. And I think 80% of the environmental impact of an object is baked in at design stage. So we've really got to think about the end of life of the objects that we're designing, even if they're designed to last for a really long time. Right, next question. Okay, so this one says, obviously the book is a macro level effort to dig into the perils and potentials of waste. That's a good description. What about the micro level? Can you recall an incident where you were dismayed by a fellow citizen's wasteful practice? And did you step in? Yes, I can. I live in Cornwall, which is in the far southwest of England and entirely surrounded by coastline. So we've got loads of beautiful beaches around here. And sadly, the people who visit Cornwall aren't always as respectful of our beaches as the locals. And I was recently sitting overlooking a beautiful scene towards the end of a day. The sun was coming down over the water, and there was a family who'd obviously been sat on the beach all day on a picnic blanket with all their sort of remnants of their picnic, empty coffee cups, Coke cans, crisp packets, cellophane wrappers from sandwiches and all that sort of thing. And when they'd finished their day on the beach, they stood up, picked up their blanket, shook it out and just walked away and left all that litter on the beach. My husband and I couldn't believe it. And obviously we went down and picked it up and put it in the recycling and put it in the bin because, you know, that's what you do. But yeah, it makes me sad. It makes me really sad that people can come and use these beautiful beaches and then kind of not show them that respect. But I think on a macro level, we're doing the same thing to the planet. So it's perhaps not that surprising. But perhaps if there are enough of us willing to go and pick up that rubbish and do something about it, then we might be okay as a species. Right, next question. This one says, which project in the book do you find the most beautiful? It's kind of like asking me to choose a favourite child, but if I must, you can actually see them behind me. These pieces are made by a designer who's based in Nottingham in the north of England called Amy Bolu. And they take pieces of waste, the detritus of the urban landscape, I think they call them, and then hand throw or hand turn these beautifully elegant vessels to suit each piece of waste. And I think really what they're doing is elevating street litter into gallery pieces, into objet art, and I have become a little bit obsessed with them. I keep buying them. This is an occupational hazard when you write about beautiful handcrafted objects. Right, next question. This one says, is there an area of your life that necessarily produces more waste than you would like? And what are you thinking around reducing it? Yeah, so I took part in Zero Waste Week in September, and the theme this year was food. So the idea is really to reduce your food waste as much as possible. When I was growing up, my mum was a really thrifty cook. So things like batch cooking, eating up leftovers, turning the veg drawer in the fridge into soup, those things are all quite commonplace to me. But the bits I struggle with are the inedible bits of food waste, so kind of the middle out of a bell pepper or the ends off a cucumber. My dog gets those that he can eat, but we still throw an awful lot away. So I'm actually looking into getting a composter. Now, I've got a tiny garden, so I've got really no need for compost. But I thought rather than it going into landfill, and the thing about food waste is although we think it biodegrades, and it does biodegrade, it produces an awful lot of methane in the process. So if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest producer of greenhouse gases after the US and China. So food waste is an issue, but if we can compost it and kind of mulch it all down and put it back into the soil, then that's a really good thing. But as I said, I don't really need much compost. But I thought, Maybe I could give it away to my neighbours. I live in a small village with lots of gardening folk, and wouldn't that be a much more lovely thing to do than just to put it into landfill? So that's my next plan to reduce my own waste. Right, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Let's have a look at this one. Do you think the most valuable thinking around food waste will happen at government level or corporate level, as per the pret-a-manger example in the book? So just to share what that is, pret-a-manger collect up all the food at the end of each day and distribute it to local charities working with people affected by homelessness. So that's how they take care of their food waste. Or indeed at individual level. This is a really interesting question. So I think a lot of the narrative around waste, we hear reduce, reuse, recycle a lot. That's a phrase that's been drummed into most of us from a young age. And I think that puts all the emphasis on consumers, right? And actually, one of the amazing statistics I discovered in my research for the book was that for every 1 sack of trash we put out on the street of sort of domestic waste, 70 sacks of trash has been generated in the making of all the objects that go into our single sack. So actually, whilst I think it's incredibly important for us to sort of claim our personal agency and make the difference that we can to our own personal waste footprints, I think we've also got to start pushing back up the chain. I think we've got to start writing to our local supermarkets, writing to our MPs. There are people who kind of take everything out of the packaging at the till in the supermarket and leave it all there for the cashier to deal with. And whilst I think that's probably a little bit unfair to the cashier, it does send the message back to the supermarket that we don't want all this plastic wrapped around our fruit. So yeah, I think the change has got to come at the level of big business and at government level. And I think we've all got to start advocating for that change and become citizens and not just consumers. Right, last question. The book is full of ingenious new ideas around rethinking and repurposing waste. Do you have a favourite or one that you particularly admire for its ingenuity? I do actually. There's a project in the book by a London-based designer called James Shaw, and he actually works with the sweepings off a recycling facility's floor, so the waste plastic from recycling. And he's collaborated with an engineer and made this incredible extrusion gun. And he tips these pellets into the top, and then out of this gun sort of squirts these Play-Doh-like noodles of this kind of plastic, which has been heated and melted. And then he draws furniture in 3D and makes these incredible sort of Play-Doh baroque looking items. And he actually calls it plastic baroque. The idea being that by connecting the word plastic, which we tend to think of as something low value and sort of disposable, with the word baroque, which evokes luxury and opulence, he can sort of reposition plastic and have us see it as a more valuable thing that we shouldn't be throwing away so much. So that's all the questions done. Brilliant questions. Thank you so much. It's been really lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for Design Milk. Thank you so much to Design Milk for having me. And this is the book, Wasted, When Trash Becomes Treasure.